Hello, lovelies. You're listening to episode 34 of the Broken Enchantments podcast, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. That's me. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Be sure to check out my Patreon for next week's episode, now available. You can check out the links below. Happy listening. At breakfast, Janir scraped her fork so hard against her china plate that it cracked. It made a terrific shattering noise and interrupted the conversation the queen was having with one of her attendants about some stupid thing or other. The servants rushed to clear away the remains of the plate and Janir's uneaten breakfast. "I know, Lady Janir. We're all concerned for Lord Caersynn," the footman said in a low voice. Janir gratefully acknowledged him with a discreet nod. Giving a clumsy bow, she excused herself and headed to the walls of the castle. The cold wind whipped her hair across her face, billowing through her skirt. She turned her eyes in the direction of the Crichton Road, but soon couldn't stand still and paced to the top of the battlement like a sentry. Every 5 minutes a guard would pass by, hardly taking any notice of her, and she took no notice of them. Except for one. He was as nondescript as the rest of them, save he looked straight into her face and his gaze followed her long after she had passed. Janir didn't recognize him, but there was something familiar about him. Something in his eyes, or perhaps behind his eyes, made her think of an Argotolum. After 7 years, when she had met her brother, she recognized him, and she wondered. But she was certain that this man wasn't an Argotolum. Her intuition, gut, or whatever it was, told her that much. He just had something of an Argotolum clinging to him. Perhaps he had been struck with a carcatan? Janir instinctively reached for the comforting weight of her own. Since she had been without them twice when she had needed them, first in Saradin and then when they were chased by the dwarves, she decided that from now on she would always keep them close. They were hidden in the folds of her skirt, stored in the pockets meant for fans and other frivolities. All the same, Janir repositioned herself to another portion of the wall, away from the guard. She alternated her time between kneading the hem of her sleeve, fingering the stone Seovan had given her before slipping it back under her collar, and pacing, sometimes doing all three. She kept her eyes glued to the horizon, even though she couldn't imagine any likely scenario that would bring the men back before dusk. Janir thought she would go mad. Was this what Armandius had felt like when she had been... Well, he hadn't known where she was at the time, and if he had, it would have made it far worse. But was this how agitated he had been when she was gone? She sighed and continued pacing. She hadn't slept at all after the soldiers left, and exhaustion weighed at her bones like lead weights. Yet it seemed her anxiety was a fire that kept burning inside and made it impossible for her to be still. Her imagination took hold of her. She began envisioning Seovan run through with a dozen spears at once, and Armandius having his head cut off by the slavish lord from the road. Ideas of how they could die had been trickling through since last night, but now they poured into her mind in torrents. They could be trampled, shot with arrows, stabbed by an enemy blade, accidentally killed by one of the Brevians, or even... Armandius had once told Janir that there were times when large armies were fighting. Men got bunched up together so tight in the heat of battle that some were suffocated. But there weren't any large armies involved, she reminded herself. "A rider approaches!" cried a sentry from the wall. Janir whirled around. Sure enough, a lone messenger approached from the direction of the mountains. He was riding his chestnut at an easy canter. Whatever the message was, it couldn't be too urgent. Still, Janir's heart leapt to her throat. She glanced to the sky to check the sun, but it was another cloudy day, and she couldn't tell the hour. Janir sprinted to a narrow wooden staircase that was little more than a ladder, and raced down as fast as she could. On the 3rd step from the bottom, she tripped on her skirt and tumbled to the stone courtyard. Janir brushed off in time to hear the rider loudly proclaim that he had a message for Broffi and Dame Celila. The rest of the message was delivered to a page, before Janir could get close enough to hear. Once his task was completed, the messenger led his horse to the stables. Janir trotted to the side of a boy of about 10, with a smudged face and an uneven, raggedy fringe of hair showing from under his cap. "Excuse me, did you hear what the messenger said?" "Sure did, ma'am." The boy nodded. "He says that they won and that Lord Caersyn's sending back the wounded and to be ready." The boy beamed with pleasure. "Gave them Slavish a right proper beatin's what they did." "Did he say how many were wounded?" "Aye, ma'am." "And?" "I forgot, ma'am," the boy sheepishly replied. "All right," Janir sighed. "Thank you." "Oh, but he did mention Lord Caersyn's been hurt." Janir snapped around to him. "Lord Caersyn." "It's nothing," Armandius insisted. "People are shot every day. It happens all the time." "No, it doesn't." Janir stared with horror at the broken-off arrow shaft protruding from betwixt the plates of his armor. "They stub their toes or get hangnails." Janir's foster-father sagged between two of his men. Blood and dirt spattered his armor, and his hair was flattened at odd angles from sweating under his helmet. His men had practically carried him off his horse, and a healer had been summoned. A healer Armandius kept on insisting he didn't need. Janir wondered in terror if her adoptive father was delirious from loss of blood. The arrow had struck just a few inches above and to the left of his heart. It would have pierced bone as it passed through. Janir shuddered as she saw the arrowhead sticking out of his back with loose and mangled flesh on the tip. About 20 wounded Brevians had been brought back to the castle by as many of their companions. 4 of the 20 injured were unconscious, either from lack of blood or a blow to the head. According to the reports, there were others with minor wounds who had stayed behind to guard the road from the return of the Slavish, but their wounds weren't incapacitating. One of the castle healer's apprentices had ridden out to see to those men. As soon as the returning party had been seen emerging from the trees, the people of the castle had rushed to help bring the wounded home. Even the 16 wounded Slavish men and a few badly injured dwarves Armandius had also ordered be brought here. "Oh, Lord Caersyn, what in the blazes have you done to yourself now?" sighed Gandon, an aged healer who had come from Virida for some peace and quiet. Armandius might have thought he was fine, but his eyes were wide open as if he were struggling to stay awake. "Nothing. There are others more in need of your attentions than me." He clumsily motioned to the other wounded being carried to the great hall and the makeshift infirmary. The healer peeled back the thick cloth of Armandius's tunic with skillful hands and examined the entry wound. "Take him to his rooms," Gandon instructed the soldiers supporting Armandius. "I'll follow you." Janir's foster-father must have been too tired to protest. She moved to follow, but the healer laid a hand on her arm, not unkindly. Before Gandon could speak, Janir burst with her question. "Will he be all right?" Gandon hesitated. "It is serious." Janir stifled a whimper and drew away from the healer, one hand to her face. "But if anyone could heal from it, I would wager on him. He's had worse, child. Now, I must go." With that, Gandon followed after the 2 soldiers with Armandius between them. "Janir." She spun around. Seovan was covered in dirt and spattered with blood, like every other soldier who had been brought back from the battlefield. But he looked unharmed, aside from a scratch just below one of his eyes and the cut on his lip. "How much of it is yours?" "What, the blood?" "Very little." He let off a slow breath, clumsily pushing back his hair. It was one of the few times she had seen him look tired. Janir wrapped her arms around him before she thought about it. He hesitated, but returned her embrace until someone from across the courtyard called him. "Forgive me," the elf apologized, "but I must—" "Go on," Janir nodded. Seovan bounded away like a deer and disappeared inside the entrance to the great hall. So Armandius and Seovan were both back again. Armandius was wounded, but he had a good chance of recovering, and Seovan was unharmed. The sky crackled, and blue veins of lightning pulsed in the grey clouds. Janir glanced up as the first sheets of icy rain fell. Any day now, The first snows could come, but for now the rain continued. Soon the patter-patter of gelid droplets filled the air as the rain soaked everything. It was as if nature were trying to wash away the signs of the battle that had come before. Janir hadn't been there, but, judging by the wounds that came from the conflict, it hadn't been a pleasant affair. Everyone scurried for shelter, even the hens that had been clucking in the farmyard. The rain would be making the men, still stationed back at the entrance to the Crichton Road, miserable, and would slow the approach of the Virida reinforcements. But it would do the same to whatever Slavish forces might be trying to, do anything. Janir ran for shelter with the others before her dress was soaked. As she trotted toward the keep, she spotted a few dozen dwarves and several Slavish men, the ones who had been overseers, all chained together and being led into the dungeons. They would be treated fairly. Armandius wouldn't hurt them, she was sure of it. They were his prisoners and under his protection. Now if only Armandius would be healed and Seovan... What did she want for Seovan? That night at dinner, Janir rearranged her food into various geometric patterns while the queen and 4 of her 5 ladies-in-waiting made small talk. Only Gwenna remained silent. This was worse than the dinner Janir had spent with Lady Rowella, because now the silliness was multiplied. The queen, for the most part, kept up the animated chatter with her attendants, but every so often, Janir caught her looking off in the direction of the mountains. She was not as at ease as she wanted everyone to believe. Janir began to worry about the future of the country. If the king had no sons, did that mean one of his daughters would be the next ruling monarch? If the princesses were half like the other women of the court, Janir envisioned the ruler of Slavin, or some other neighboring country, meeting one of the king's daughters. The foreign ruler would watch her giggle for a moment, then turn to his attendants and say, "Why are we even bothering with diplomacy when we could clearly crush all of Brevia in a week?" Janir pushed her food to the other side of her plate. Seated beside Janir, Gwenna seemed to hold as little interest for the other women's conversation as she did. Still, Janir didn't want to speak, even with Gwenna. And the noblewoman seemed to sense that, even if a clairvoyant's powers were useless on an Argotolum. The second course was cleared away, and the third course, roasted pheasant, was served. Under the table, Janir slid one of her carcatan from its place in her skirt and let it hang at her side, under a fold of her dress. The dress Janir was wearing was one of her favorites, dark green linen with a narrow brown trim around the neckline and cuffs. It didn't have the long-sleeved trains that were so good at concealing things. But the assurance that the carcatan gave her was like leather gloves on a cold day. After a few moments, it was small help against her fears for Armandius, but it was help all the same. She glanced up at the servant who placed her plate in front of her, and 2 things caught her attention. The first was that, as she turned her eyes to him, he was just looking away from the carcatan she had failed to conceal. The second was that he was the guard from earlier that day, now in the uniform of a manservant. Shivers of fear and confusion shuddered through her bones. Janir gulped, trying to hide her alarm. You have been listening to Broken Enchantments, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. Don't forget to check out my Patreon for early access to episodes, bonus content, and lots of patrons-only freebies. You can learn more at elizabethwheatley.com. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube. I'll see you next time.